back, and every once in a while we take stock with a colleague by the name of Peter Huessy of a topic that altogether too few Americans give much thought to. Fortunately, Peter does and has for decades. It's the issue of nuclear deterrence, what it takes, and whether we are doing both the programmatic things and even just the basic intellectual work that is required to assure that adversaries of this country who may think that they could fight and win a nuclear war are dissuaded from doing so. Peter Huessy brings a great experience in government, both in the executive branch and on Capitol Hill. He has worked for many years subsequent to his time in government, helping lift up these sorts of issues with Washington policymakers and congressional staff and others in a series of programs of various kinds that have, I think, been enormously important in filling a void. And we're going to talk about that void, where it came from, why it has persisted, and the implications if we don't get it fixed. These days, Peter is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, as well as the president of Geostrategic Analysis. Always welcome here, Peter. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Frank. I'm always honored to come by and talk with you.
Thank you. So, we've been forced to reflect at least a little bit of late about threats of nuclear warfighting coming from Vladimir Putin in the aftermath of his invasion of Ukraine and his response to some of the things that the Americans and others have done. There's always this overlay to what we're hearing from the Chinese. We were talking a little bit about that with Grant Newsom a moment ago, that they too have now nuclear warfighting capabilities. Um, Give us a sense, Peter, of where we stand in terms of our nuclear warfighting doctrine and thinking, as well as capabilities.
Well, it's a good question, Frank, and it's one that is the top agenda on the head of our strategic command, Admiral Richard. And Richard Clark, who is now head of the Air Force Academy, told me when he left A-10 in the Air Force, which he had the bombers and ICBMs, he said, this is the issue we wrestle with every day, particularly having two countries, China and Russia, both nuclear capable, that are peer competitors conventionally. What happens if a conventional war or conflict can go nuclear two ways? And these two countries are not deterred the same way. And we stopped thinking about this issue, as you know, at the end of the Cold War. I went back and looked at a number of comments made by various senators. The whole idea of having a nuclear deterrent, yeah, we'll have a minimum one, but we can go towards disarmament. And as you know, we've been wrestling with this for a long, long time. When Eisenhower didn't want to meet Soviet conventional capability one to one because that'll go broke. So he said, I'll do massive retaliation. Kennedy comes in and says, that's not very credible because you're going to risk Armageddon and suicide if they go into West Germany. That was our whole extended deterrent. And as it developed over time, as you know, we dramatically cut nuclear weapons from 12,000 down to about 2,000. That's the real number. So the question then is, Mr. Putin, when he became president of Russia, had already put into place this escalate to win doctrine. And this is where we are, which is giving us real pause. And that is, he will use a limited number of nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict or threaten to do so to get us to stand down,
Mhm.
meaning we won't even get in the fight.
And partly that's because he sees a gap, basically,
Yes,
between the capabilities that he has
yes,
put into place, the so-called theater nuclear
yes.
capabilities, and those that we have in place. But partly, Peter, I guess he must be also reading, and presumably the Chinese too, the cumulative dearth of our sort of thinking about nuclear warfighting. Notably, as it happens, we've allowed an awful lot of our force to become pretty obsolescent.
Mhm,
We've not maintained the industrial base that's
mhm.
required to support it. The laboratories that we have can kind of hand build a couple of nuclear weapons per year, I think. But essentially, we're more or less out of the business of modernizing our forces.
Yeah,
And
we're
when
out
you
of the
put all that
business.
together
Yeah,
with a perceived gap like he sees, I got to say that probably incentivizes one or both of these uh, powerful adversaries to believe that they might be able to use nuclear weapons decisively and win. No.
someone quipped the other day in an event that North Korea can build more nuclear warheads than the United States on an annual
Yes.
basis, and unfortunately, that's true. What the minimal deterrent global zero people think is any use of nuclear weapons will escalate very rapidly to Armageddon,
Hmm.
and may be right. The problem is Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping don't believe that.
Hmm.
They believe, unless you think it's total bluff, that they'd never use nuclear weapons if we challenge them. But remember, the administration, for good or bad, I'm not saying one way or the other, in December said, we're not going to send American forces to Ukraine, period. We're not going to
Right.
get in the air and start shooting at Russian planes because they said it will go nuclear.
Hmm.
And Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, said any conflict where the United States intervenes will go to World War III, which will be nuclear war. So the
Right.
question in my mind is, and you've raised this issue, is it possible to have nuclear weapons at the low level, medium range that are deterrent enough for Putin and Xi Jinping to say the United States, no matter where the fight is across the spectrum, can retaliate in a way that takes away their options to get what they want? Win is,
Hmm.
you can say it's winning, that's not the issue. What's their objectives? If I can deny them their objectives, if I just have gravity bombs on fighter planes in England, have to go through air defenses, take time to get where they're going. The sovereign basing is always an issue. They have literally thousands of these weapons. We have 200 in Europe, and we have none in Asia. None in, right, none in Asia. So if you combine missile defense with theater and robust strategic systems, and you do have arms control to Russia, where at least half their systems are under some kind of control, the combination enhances deterrence. But if you take any one of them and say, well, we don't need theater weapons, nuclear weapons, and arms control, we can kind of pretend, because sometimes we have kind of looked the other way when Russia violates these things, which they do almost universally. And if
Yeah.
your conventional forces are weak, you just said you send a signal to the bad guys. This is the opportunity to do what they want to do, and
To
that's what we're
act.
trying to deny them the right, the sense that they can get away with it.
Amen. Peter, I want to come back to arms control in just a second, but first, one thing that's implicit in what you just said is you have to have modern nuclear
Yes,
capabilities. If
yes.
they're modest or even small, they have to be credible. They have to be
Yes.
effective, and
Well, just
just
Frank, from the point of view of,
perpetuating what we've had for decades
right, you don't
indefinitely
want
is not
systems
that.
that cost you an arm and a leg to maintain, that break a
Hmm.
lot or have to be repaired. And the thing is, the miracle of the industrial base and the Air Force and the Navy is they've kept systems that are now 40, 50, 60, and going to be 70 years old because they had to. I mean, they don't buy stuff.
Yeah,
We do.
it's
Congress does. The president does.
unbelievable.
And we now are in the process of, by the end of this decade, we will begin to modernize the entire force. We'll bring forces in. And the problem is the bad guys have Russia's 90% complete, and China, pick a number because we don't know where they're ending up. They're
Yeah.
considerably way down that road.
Very substantial modernization programs in both places.
Yes.
So, Peter, you mentioned arms control. I've been rather skeptical of it over
Yes,
the
you have,
years,
sir.
as you know, uh, not least because, as you say, there's been a lot of winking and nodding as the Russians and before them the Soviets violated every one of their obligations. The Chinese haven't even gotten into much in the way of arms control, biological weapons convention and being an exception, but they've been violating that. Um, when you look at this, people suggest that, well, we've got to get the Chinese into an arms control arrangement. They've evinced no interest in doing that. Where do you come down on both the feasibility of doing it
Mhm.
and the utility?
Well, first of all, you can't have any kind of an agreement unless you have transparency,
Hmm.
and the Chinese have zero transparency. I mean,
Right.
how do you sign an agreement that says, "Okay, Louis, you only have 10"? Well, how many do you have now? It's like dealing with the Iranians. You
Hmm.
know, what nuclear activities have you previously done so we can put an end to it? Oh, you can't go there because that's classified.
Right.
Okay. Or the United Nations, you can turn the cameras on. Oh, by the way, the film from it, you can't get any of the images.
Hmm.
So, arms control, in my mind, has always been if you can add something to U.S. security, fine, but the basis is your deterrent.
Yep.
Without a modernized deterrent, you can't go anywhere. And my view is China, there's no transparency. And if the disarmament arms control community wanted to do a real service, push very hard on people they talk to in China and get them to be transparent.
Mm.
In my mind, you can't go anywhere without that.
Peter, this is a subject to which we will return. We don't want
Yes.
to go nowhere. We want to go somewhere. And these
Yeah.
conversations are really important in trying to illuminate where we do need to go to maintain a
Yes.
credible nuclear
But I
deterrent.
wouldn't go
Thank you
anywhere with
for your
China on
time.
this now.
Amen. Well, I don't think that's an option, frankly. Peter, we
Exactly.
have to leave it at that. Thank you. Come back to us soon. We're going to talk with Kenny Zhu, a man about the minority of Asians and whether they're being mistreated racist, racistly. That and more straight ahead.